Welcome everyone to Keep It Classy Tech, and in this video I want to talk about why some people will say that OLED TVs or maybe even just HDR or Dolby Vision looks too dim. Also, to distinguish the differences in what brightness means when people talk about a TV being brighter or not being brighter. So I'm going to start with an SDR scene and give an explanation. Alright, so this is an SDR scene, and what I'm going to do is toggle through some picture modes that I have set up, and I can give you the 10% window brightness measurements for those picture modes, but then afterwards what I'm going to do is actually measure this right where it's at with each mode. And so what I'm going to do is start in filmmaker mode. So the SDR standard is 2.4 gamma at 100 nits. That's what this is. So I have filmmaker set so that it would measure at 100 nits, and that's how bright the standard says that this should look. So that means when this was created, this is how bright it was supposed to be. And now I'm going to switch over to this mode, which I have set to 165 nits. This is what I use if I'm going to have moderate lighting turned on in the room. And then if I go to this picture mode, I have this set to about 250 nits. And then this one is pretty much maxed out at over 400 nits. Again, that's if you are measuring a 10% window. So this is not how it's supposed to look. And so what has happened over the years is we went from TVs that were, plasmas were struggling to hit 100 nits when they were coming out, and through most of the time period that we had them, it wasn't until towards the end of the plasma life cycle that we were getting 100 nits or so. So this is what is expected for you to watch in a dark room. Right now this room is dark, and I'm doing that just to show that most people over the years has gotten accustomed to increasing the brightness with every couple years, or each time they replace a TV, and the TVs have been getting brighter and brighter. So like this right here is meant to be watched like this with lights on in the room. But again, a lot of people have gotten used to watching like this in the dark, and then got used to watching like this in the dark. And then here, this is as bright as the OLED can get for SDR content. This is with peak brightness on high and the OLED lights maxed out. I'm not sure how well the camera is translating. I tried to set it as best to what I'm seeing, so you can at least see the differences here, what I've set up. So, again, 400 plus nits for SDR content is extremely bright. It is way too bright. This is not how it was intended. If you're in a very bright room with lots of windows, there's a lot of lights on, you're watching sports or cable or whatever, that's different. The problem is people got used to that and they don't want to change settings, so they'll go from watching their football game with the brightness turned up all the way and the lights on, and then they'll just put in a movie and turn off the lights and still be watching with the brightness turned up like this. So I'm going to go ahead and start running the measurements here, just so you can see, whatever tree that the meter's pointed at right now. Let's just see what we're measuring at. So in this bright mode, it's only 17 nits on that tree. And then if we go to this, which if it was a 10% white window would be 250, we're dropping down to 12. So just think about that in terms of percentage. And now this one, this is the 165 nit mode. It's now measuring 9 nits. And if we put it into the SDR standard, it's now dropped all the way to 4. So I just want you to think about that. That tree in the dark, all those trees are perfectly visible, and it's only measuring 4 nits. So you don't need 400 nits. Just something to think about when looking at brightness measurements. So now what I'm going to do is switch over to HDR, and I'm also going to show some screenshots of slides and or graphs and whatnot to show, technically what is happening and what you're seeing. Alright, it must sound a bit different as I'm recording this after the fact. So, in this chart, what you're seeing, that yellow line is how the gamma is supposed to track through the entire range from black to white. If you look at the bottom, red, green, and blue values to get the brightness to match as close to that target. So the red line on the chart that I drew is an exaggeration, but it's just showing if you were to have your midtones blown out, that's what it would look like. Again, exaggerated. That would mean like your dark, shadowy areas, instead of looking dark and shadowy, they could kind of glow almost if they're overly bright. Now the opposite effect is also true. If you undertrack that yellow line, then everything's too dark. It's what you would call as crush black. So you can see that with this mode, I calibrated. It's very close, and again, you can set that pure white to whatever your TV is capable of and whatever you're comfortable with in your environment. So this is where the term brightness needs a little more defining when people say it, because in SDR, if you want that to be 300 nits, you could do that, and then the image will be brighter overall. But the main thing is your mid-range, making sure that it's not too bright, because if you make that too bright, then your whole image just kind of falls apart. So let's move on to Dolby Vision and HDR and try to explain some more what's going on. Alright, here's a scene I paused on Our Planet. This is in Dolby Vision, and it's fairly white, a lot of snow, and even still, it's only measuring at 83 nits. Now why is that? Well, because HDR and Dolby Vision, most of the scene that you're seeing falls in that SDR space range. It's only in specific, very bright highlights. Let me bring up the pointer. So like if you were to look over in this section, it's going to pull up the menu, but those little bright dots right there. So if I get rid of the pointer, those little bright dots underneath where it shows the picture mode, like that, I'm sure if I could measure something that small, is going to be brighter. Those are HDR highlights. So with HDR, you have still your main scene that falls in that SDR range, and then you have your highlights, which are brighter. But just because your TV is capable of 700, 800, 1000, 1500, whatever nits at a 10% window in a synthetic setting, you're never going to get that in a real content scenario. So this is why being able to measure below 1% windows, or even smaller than that, and then or in very large windows, it matters, because that's more representative of your average picture level of everything you're seeing on the screen. Every pixel on the screen is getting a certain amount of energy, and so the more that is sent to what we refer to as midtones or mid-range, that's everything that's not dark and not very bright. So the more, that's where most of the energy goes to. And so if there's a very bright spot in the image, it's not going to have enough energy to hit what the TV is fully capable of. And it also just depends on when it was created, what it was shot in, what the metadata is saying that spot is supposed to be. If it says it's supposed to be a 400 nit bright spot, then if the TV is doing its tone mapping correctly, then it would be at 400 nits regardless of what TV you have. So now if I go switch over to Cinema Home, which is I've shown in the previous video, is basically like having dynamic tone mapping turned on for Dolby Vision, then the average picture level just went up. So now it's measuring 95 nits where it's at, when in the more accurate cinema mode, it's measuring 84 nits. So if Dolby Vision or HDR or an OLED, whatever, seems dark or dim to you, it's likely because you have gotten accustomed to a very bright SDR TV. And so you have gotten used to what's a very bright overall average picture level, and HDR and Dolby Vision, the main purpose is to have a lower, darker range and then have it spike up to the highlights, and the average picture level is likely going to be lower than if you had an overly bright SDR TV. Now, if you turn on dynamic tone mapping, or like on this TV using Cinema Home for Dolby Vision, then it can increase your average picture level at the cost of your bright highlights getting not quite as bright in some scenes. Alright, now this image is for HDR, but it's similar to what we looked at previously. It's just now you can see from 80 through 100 is where you reach your clipping point, and that's as bright as it gets, and then that's for your HDR highlights. You can see from 60 to 70, that's your transition from like SDR type brightness up to those HDR highlights, and then from 0 through 50, that's where most of your image is going to be, is in that range, and that's very similar to what SDR would be. And without raising the entire average picture level, that's going to be close to what SDR is technically supposed to be, not what people have gotten used to by boosting their SDR brightness so much. So if you look at that EOTF chart on the top where I drew the red line, if you do have dynamic tone mapping or use something like that to boost your mid-range, that's what it would look like. It would over-brighten everything in the middle, and then that increases your average picture level brightness, but with over-brightened mid-range, it won't look like how it was shot. Now, most people actually don't care how it was shot or how it's supposed to look, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's your TV, you do what you want. I'm just trying to explain why some people will go out and buy a new OLED or be looking at HDR or Dolby Vision for the first time and be wondering, why is this darker than what I'm coming from? Why I thought I was getting an upgrade. And I'm just trying to show visually what is happening and why some people feel that way. And then you have a TV like the Samsung QN90A, where it doesn't have the option to turn off dynamic tone mapping, so it's always going to have those midtones raised a little bit too much. And again, if that's what someone likes, there's nothing wrong with that, and I got no problem with that. That's what that person likes. If they want that extra brightness, if they want to be able to see everything more easily, that's up to them, and there's, again, nothing wrong with that. Got no problem with it. It's not how it was shot. It's not what the creator thought you should be seeing, but I know most people just want what looks better to their own eyes. Alright, so I'm going to show one more image that's HDR, and then finish up with something else. Alright, now this is HDR, and it's a bright outdoorsy scene from the Grand Tour on Amazon. So right now it's in cinema mode. Let me just double check what settings are turned on here. So tone mapping is off. And then if I go to Cinema Home, I'm going to turn tone mapping on, and then they should be the same other than the tone mapping. So here, Cinema Home with the tone mapping on, measuring 270 nits on the roof of that car. This is a very bright image that I'm looking at right now. The average picture level is very bright, but yet we're still only measuring 270 nits. So when people use the word brightness, my question is, what do you mean? Do you mean the overall brightness of the entire image like this, being very, very bright, being overly bright, brighter than it's supposed to be? Do you mean what the max brightness the TV is capable of in a measurement? And there's a very long discussion to be had about measurements, why they are almost useless, and at least until a better standard can be created of how to actually measure brightness. But maybe we'll talk about that a little bit at the end of this. So again, here if I go to cinema mode, this is how it was shot, this is how it looked, this is what the creator was seeing when they shot this. This is how it should look. And again, we go back to Cinema Home, and everything's way too bright. So what this is doing is we're increasing the mid-range and mid-tone brightness. We're not really increasing any of the bright highlights. Like if I look at that chrome strip on above the window of the car, that's shining bright. Any of the chrome that you see shining, I'm not really seeing any change in that. It's everything else. I'm seeing the trees get brighter. I'm seeing Jeremy Clarkson get brighter. I'm seeing the dark areas of the track getting brighter, and they're not supposed to do that. But I'm not saying that it's wrong if you like that. I'm trying to distinguish right now what people mean when they say HDR is too dim, or OLED TVs are too dim, or what is the brightness when they say it's not bright enough, or it's too bright, or just we're trying to define or show that there is a wide curtain of what the word brightness can mean, because depending on your context, brightness could mean your highlights in HDR, or it can mean your average picture level, also in HDR, and it can also mean in SDR you wanting the entire image to be brighter than it's supposed to be. Like, there's just it leaves a lot of confusion on the table when people just say the word brightness or brighter or bright or dim. Why is an OLED dim? Why is HDR dim? Because if you're used to looking at a 400, 500, 600 nit SDR image on a really bright LCD TV, and then you go and you buy a new OLED and you turn on something in HDR and you see this and you're told this is accurate, this is what it's supposed to look like. Right now we're measuring 130 nits. Then you can turn this on, you can get closer to what you're used to. Again, this was 260, 255. So it definitely increases everything brighter to look more like a overly bright SDR image. But HDR is a high dynamic range, meaning you can take an image that has pure black or very dark areas and have very, very bright objects in that scene at the same time. That is what HDR is for. That is what OLED is very good at, is being able to show those pure blacks and being able to show a very bright highlight right next to them with no blooming. And even if you had, a QLED or whatever, same scenario. You're going to have a very bright object in the same scene as something very dark, and SDR couldn't do that. That's why we have HDR. Alright, so this is somewhat related. I'm going to be using this scene for ABL, or Automatic Brightness Limiter. It's the real-world content scene that I can think of that would mostly be affected by an ABL. So in the future, I'm just going to keep my meter right next to his hand like that, so it's in the same spot on the same scene. And the idea of this is to show when people say OLEDs are too dim because of the ABL, it's not exactly true. The only time ABL is going to dim things down is if there's a lot of white or very bright on this very large area of the screen. And even then, in this scene, this is like being a worst case scenario for ABL, it's still measuring higher than what the average scene with lots of color and so on would be. So I'm going to be doing another video in the next few days talking about different types of dimming, mostly regarding OLEDs, but do know that LCDs also have an ABL, and I'm going to go over the difference between an ABL, an ASBL, logo detection dimming, talk about image retention, all of that kind of stuff. So just keep an eye out for that. And if you like this video, just a reminder, if you press the like button, I know we ran pretty long at about 20 minutes. I'm sure I could have gone even more in depth about brightness and seeing comments about this TV's too dim or that TV's dim or HDR or Dolby Vision's dim and so on. But I just wanted to show that the only reason it would appear dim is if you have gotten accustomed to very, very bright average picture level in SDR, and you're not going to get that with HDR and Dolby Vision, at least especially with an OLED. So anyway, thanks for watching. I hope this helps some of you understand what other people are meaning when they say that, or just understand what is going on with the brightness of new TVs. And have a good one.